Everyone thinks the Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg. But what if that was only the final spark? From a bridge racing through icy waters, while every officer believed the unsinkable ship was unstoppable, to two lookouts staring into a pitch-black night without binoculars, their only warning hidden in the shadows. This is what really happened on that dark, eerie night, with every shadow hiding a threat. Let's explore the many tiny mistakes that sank the Titanic. By late afternoon on April 14th, the Atlantic was already sending warnings. Wireless operators on nearby ships reported drifting pack ice and large icebergs along the Titanic's route. Messages came steadily, some routine, some urgent, with exact coordinates. On the bridge, the information was noted, yet the ship's pace remained nearly unchanged. Under Captain Edward Smith, Titanic pressed forward at close to 22 knots, about 25 miles per hour. In the open ocean, that speed was safe but dangerously fast through ice. Passengers sensed a subtle shift before they understood the danger. The sea had grown almost glassy, with no swell breaking against the hull. That stillness removed one of the ocean's natural warning signs. Normally, waves crash at the base of icebergs, creating foam visible even in darkness. Without it, ice blended into the water, nearly invisible. The night also turned sharply colder, with survivors recalling air biting through heavy coats. Inside the ship, the speed dictated every decision that followed. The Titanic's enormous mass carried momentum that couldn't be shed quickly. Even if the engines reversed immediately, physics ensured a long stopping distance. At high velocity, the window for safe maneuvering shrank to seconds. Spotting ice relied entirely on human eyes and the crow's nest, scanning a dark horizon without aid. The faster the ship moved, the quicker unseen obstacles closed in. Ice warnings were not ignored but filtered through faith in the ship's strength. Confidence in the Titanic's advanced design encouraged speed rather than caution. With watertight compartments and remotely operated doors, the vessel represented White Star Line's pinnacle of engineering. That reputation shaped judgment. Full speed was proof of reliability, and slowing seemed necessary only when danger was visible.
Smith would not have been unduly worried by the iceberg risk. 7 months earlier, he'd been captain of the Olympic when she survived a serious collision.
As evening deepened, that belief set the stage for disaster. High speed closed the distance to obstacles quickly, leaving visual detection as the last line of defense. Any delay in spotting ice would leave almost no time to react. Design, calm seas, and darkness quietly erased the margin for error long before the lookout's call. When the iceberg finally appeared, it was already too close. Momentum limited turning limited options, and options shrank to a single hurried maneuver shaped entirely by speed chosen hours earlier. The collision was not sudden, but the inevitable result of warnings, confidence, and momentum converging in a way that left the Titanic almost no chance to avoid disaster. Speed left no room for error, and when reaction time shrank, the lookout's limited vision became a deadly liability. Titanic's lookouts were high in the crow's nest, scanning the black Atlantic for any sign of danger. For hours, they strained their eyes across a flat, featureless sea, searching for shapes barely visible against the darkness. The work was exhausting, made harder by nightfall's tricks. Icebergs don't glow, they don't move, and in the calm North Atlantic, even massive formations could look like part of the water itself. One tool could have made all the difference: binoculars. But the keys were missing. During a last-minute crew rotation in Southampton, the binoculars had been locked in an officer's cabin, completely inaccessible to the men whose job was to spot danger first. On a ship moving at 22 knots through icy waters, that small oversight carried enormous consequences. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee did everything possible, sweeping the horizon for irregularities, shadows, or glimmers of ice. Yet human vision alone, even from that height, had limits. Icebergs reflected little light and often appeared flat, their jagged peaks invisible until dangerously close. At full speed, about 33 feet per second, each second of delayed detection meant that the ship already closed tens of feet on the obstacle, losing critical reaction time.
At spotting icebergs. But on the night of April the 14th, they lacked a critical piece of kit.
The missing binoculars were not the only factor, but they magnified the danger. Confidence in the Titanic's size and design had already shaped decisions. Officers assumed sight alone would suffice, and the ship was not slowed, nor were extra lookouts added. Without optical aid, the iceberg remained hidden until fleet finally spotted it, but by then, it was already too late.
How much sooner?
Well enough to get out of the way.
Once it appeared, everything had to happen instantly. Bridge officers had only seconds to act. At that speed, turning the ship was no longer about precision, but a desperate struggle to survive. And every decision had to be made under extreme pressure. A simple tool, a set of keys, might have made the situation manageable, yet its absence turned the challenge into an almost impossible emergency. It was a quiet, nearly invisible failure, proving that the iceberg was not the first cause, but the final visible outcome of small mistakes stacking up. The disaster was already unfolding long before Fleet shouted. You could tell a lot from his reply.
Suppose you had glasses, such as you had on the Oceanic, or such as you had between Belfast and Southampton. Could you have seen this black object a greater distance?
We could have seen it a bit sooner.
How much sooner?
Well, enough to get out of the way.
Without binoculars, what was invisible to the eye relied entirely on warnings, but those warnings were muddled, delayed, or ignored. Long before the Titanic reached the ice field, its wireless system for communication was advanced, but it relied entirely on human operation. Operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were swamped with passenger telegrams, and clearing that backlog became the priority. Ice warnings arrived amid this constant flow, often encoded in short signals that could easily seem routine. One critical message didn't contain any label, so Phillips treated it as a routine check.
As it was, it didn't have them, so he set the message aside for later and carried on with his passenger traffic.
Other warnings were delayed simply because they had to wait for their turn. Messages were queued, grouped, and forwarded later. But in reality, even a short delay mattered. At full speed, the ship covered vast distances in minutes. By the time some alerts reached the bridge, the Titanic had already closed dangerously toward the ice. No dramatic failure occurred. The breakdown was simply a series of ordinary decisions under pressure.
A vital message came in from the nearby Californian, who radioed the Titanic to say that they were stopped and surrounded by ice. Now, unfortunately, right at the moment that it arrived, the wireless operators on the Titanic were really busy doing what's called working Cape Race.
However, confidence shaped how the information was received. Ice was not treated as an immediate threat, but as manageable. Warnings were acknowledged but not acted on urgently. The ship pressed forward, and the full picture never coalesced.
Titanic's new route would take her straight into an ice field bristling with giant bergs. But the message never reached Captain Smith.
By the time the danger was understood, precious time had vanished. The iceberg had been along the ship's path for hours, but delays, misread signals, and routine handling left the bridge little chance to plan ahead. And if that wasn't enough, another warning came from a nearby ship. But a critical mistake hid the danger. The message had 3 letters, MSG, missing, garbling the words and confusing the bridge. And so by the time anyone realized something was off, the iceberg was already too close to avoid. The result was a chain reaction of small oversights. No single mistake caused the disaster. Minor lapses accumulated until the ship approached the ice field with incomplete awareness. The warnings existed, but they never formed a clear signal. But even messages that did get through couldn't fight nature itself because the glassy calm of the sea masked the danger until it was almost too late. By the time the Titanic reached the thickest part of the ice field, the ocean had become strangely still. Survivors later said that the sea looked flat like glass. There were no waves, no foam, no movement on the surface. At first, calm water sounds helpful, but at night, it removed one of the ocean's usual warning signs. When waves hit an iceberg, they normally break into white foam around its base. That foam can be seen from far away, even in low light. On this night, the water stayed smooth. The iceberg rose straight from out of the sea with no visible outline. It blended into the darkness and remained unnoticed until the last moment.
The night the Titanic sank, that one crew member said you could have played a game of football. This gave them confidence that they could go fast and still see the iceberg.
The sky made things worse. There was no moon on April 14, 1912. Without moonlight reflecting the water, the horizon disappeared into a single dark surface. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stood in the crow's nest, scanning a view that offered almost no contrast. They reached through the darkness that stretched in every direction. Even a massive iceberg could remain hidden until it blocked the stars behind it. By the time Fleet saw that change and rang the warning bell, very little distance remained. Because the sea was calm and the night was motionless, spotting danger depended entirely on how close the ship was. This might have been manageable at a slower speed, but once again, the Titanic continued moving fast, and every second without a clear sighting reduced the space needed to turn. The officers on the bridge had no clear sign that visibility had quietly worsened. Days of smooth sailing had made speed feel normal, and the calm sea offered no warning and quietly hid the danger instead. This detail mattered because it combined with earlier problems. The lookouts had no binoculars, so they relied only on their eyesight. Ice warnings had been delayed or unclear, so the bridge lacked precise information. Now the environment itself removes early detection, while the ship's speed reduces reaction time. Together, these conditions left almost no margin for error.
There's no wind, but it's still clear. We've still got good visibility. They still believed they would see a berg in plenty of time to avoid it.
Survivors later described how deceptive the night had been. Many said icebergs became easy to see only after the collision, when distance no longer mattered. From afar, shapes that should have stood out blended into the horizon. The smooth water erased depth and scale. The crew was not navigating a visibly dangerous area. They were moving through one that concealed its threats.
And that was that. She stopped. We had a porthole open, and I looked out, and the sky was clear, the stars were shining, the sea was dead calm. And I thought, I don't know, I couldn't understand it.
Because the iceberg remained hidden until the ship was already close, the situation became a race against time. When those seconds disappeared, the officers had to act instantly, and that split-second decision would shape everything that followed. With the iceberg hidden until the last moment, the Titanic's own structure faced the impossible, and flaws once thought minor now mattered more than ever. From the outside, the damage did not look fatal. The iceberg had not torn a massive hole. Instead, it scraped along the starboard side below the waterline, opening a series of narrow breaches across several compartments. On paper, the ship could survive flooding in multiple sections. Watertight bulkheads were supposed to trap water and keep the vessel afloat. Yet that confidence depended on how those barriers were built and how flooding would behave in reality. There was one more critical misjudgment: dodging the iceberg. The Titanic's prow, narrow and reinforced, could have withstood a head-on collision. But in an attempt to avoid a direct hit, the ship turned, and the iceberg struck along the side instead. The side scrape hit weaker parts of the hull, loosening rivets and letting water into compartments the bulkheads couldn't contain. In that one turn, a collision that might have been manageable became a flood that would decide the ship's fate. Inside the hull, the bulkheads rose only partway toward the upper decks. They were never designed to seal the ship completely. Normally, water would fill a damaged compartment and stop there, but the designers had not accounted for progressive overflow. As the forward compartments filled, the bow dipped lower. With each tilt, water reached higher, spilling over bulkheads into the next compartment and into the next. The system worked as designed, but the design assumed the ship would stay level, but gravity had other plans.
Standing an average of 12 meters high, the bulkheads weren't tall enough to reach the passenger deck level. A deliberate choice by Titanic's designers.
The process was gradual, not dramatic. Engineers in the boiler room saw water creeping from compartment to compartment long before passengers sensed danger. Each flooded section pulled the bow lower, accelerating the next breach. Damage that should have remained isolated slowly connected, turning small leaks into a chain reaction. Material choices also amplified the problem. Hull plates were fastened with thousands of iron rivets, yet in several areas near the bow, weaker wrought iron was used. Wrought iron contains tiny impurities that can weaken under stress, especially in freezing conditions. That night, the North Atlantic was bitterly cold. When the iceberg pressed against the hull, some rivets likely loosened, allowing plate edges to separate slightly. The gaps were small, but enough for water to pour in steadily. The Titanic was not defeated by a single catastrophic tear. Multiple small breaches combined with design limits made sinking inevitable. Bulkheads treated flooding as static, but in reality, water moved minute by minute, shifting weight and pressure throughout the hull. Pumps couldn't keep up, and crew actions could not restore barriers already overtopped. Features that inspired confidence had limits, and those limits had quietly been surpassed. Yet the most deceptive factor was time, because flooding unfolded gradually. The ship remained afloat longer than expected. The lights stayed on, decks held steady, and movement felt controlled. That appearance of stability shaped human judgment. The emergency did not feel immediate, yet the outcome had already been decided. With each stage, the deck's failure would emerge not from steel or rivets, but from human response. By the time the flooding became undeniable, survival depended less on steel or speed and more on preparation. And preparation revealed the hard truth. Confidence had quietly replaced readiness. Lifeboats were on board, but they existed more to satisfy regulations than to save everyone. At the time, rules determined lifeboat numbers by a ship's tonnage, not by passenger count. The Titanic could have carried far more, yet only 20 boats were installed, enough for about half those on board. The legal requirement was met, but the actual evacuation capacity was already limited before the voyage began.
Titanic would stay afloat long enough for everyone to be evacuated.
Immediately following the collision, water floods into Titanic very fast.
Because lifeboats were seen as temporary transport to rescue ships, procedures never became central. There had been no full passenger drill, and crew training varied. Some clearly knew their responsibilities, while others were uncertain. When orders came to prepare the boats, valuable time had already been lost to the assumption that the Titanic would stay afloat longer. Urgency rose, yet coordination struggled to keep pace. Officers tried to manage loading while communicating seriousness, but instructions differed across the deck because no one had faced a crisis like this. On top of that, launching the lifeboats was difficult. The davit system could handle more boats than were present, yet many crew members had never used it in an emergency. Each launch required uncovering the boat, swinging it outward, loading passengers, and lowering it with hand-operated winches. In theory, procedure was simple. In practice, hesitation slowed every step. Some boats were lowered partly empty, as officers feared overloading the equipment. Passengers hesitated to board the small craft suspended over dark water while the ship still seemed stable. The calm deck worked against the urgency below. As the bow sank, launching became harder. Angle shifted, access narrowed, and earlier delays grew more consequential. Each lifeboat lowered without full capacity meant lost space that could not be recovered. Yet for those on deck, choices felt cautious rather than mistaken. Lights still shone, music played, and the deck felt solid, masking the danger beneath. The communication across decks was uneven. Stewards guided passengers toward the boat deck, but many had incomplete information themselves. Some passengers hesitated to leave warm interiors for uncertain waits outside. Others assumed the danger would pass. Because evacuation began before panic, urgency struggled to take hold. What should have been coordinated became a patchwork of individual decisions shaped by incomplete understanding. Earlier engineering failures had created time without safety, and preparation had been based on assumptions rather than necessity. Evacuation moved more slowly than the sinking itself. The Titanic's design expected lifeboats to ferry passengers to nearby rescuers, not serve as the main means of survival. That expectation shaped planning, training, and response. By the time the final boats departed, the consequences of those decisions were set. The question was no longer whether evacuation would continue, but who would remain aboard when opportunity ran out. Even when boats lowered, chaos spread faster than any plan, and calls for help couldn't pierce the confusion of overloaded wireless lines. After the collision, survival relied on a simple chain: sending distress, having it received, and getting help. The Titanic's wireless operators began transmitting CQD and SOS signals almost immediately, but the system was already under strain. Hours of passenger telegrams and prior ice warnings had clogged the channels, and until the emergency hit, danger had never been prioritized.
We've hit an iceberg. We are sinking 5 ahead.
25-year-old Jack had been up all the previous night.
At first, the collision didn't appear catastrophic, so the urgency of messages grew slowly. Wireless technology required constant attention, yet some nearby ships had ended their watch for the night, and others received fragmented signals without context. The closest vessel capable of assisting, the steamship Californian, had stopped amid pack ice, and its operator had gone to bed. Its crew later reported seeing rockets fired from a distance, but rockets at sea could indicate routine communication as well as distress. Without communication via wireless, these visual signals remained ambiguous. The same calm night that had hidden ice from the lookouts had now muffled the meaning of distress signals meant to save lives. The wireless operations themselves added friction. Messages needed repetition, acknowledgement, and relaying across stations with different routines. Operators under pressure often sorted overlapping transmissions that required clarification. Range limits, atmospheric conditions, and equipment sensitivity further restricted what could be heard and when. Even when distress calls reached other ships, navigation and distance meant that help could not arrive instantly. By this time, prior communications compounded the situation. Speed had reduced reaction time, visual detection had been delayed, and engineering limits had made damage inevitable. Rescue now depended on flawless communication, yet patterns from earlier in the voyage persisted. Rockets went unobserved, messages were misinterpreted, and protocols existed only on paper, filtered through human judgment. As minutes passed, the window for assistance narrowed. Water continued to spread irreversibly through compartments, and evacuation capacity dwindled. Help would eventually come, but too late to alter the outcome. A chain of small decisions shaped by overconfidence in the ship's resilience had carried the crisis beyond the point where communication alone could prevent disaster.
Jack kept tapping out messages.
We are putting passengers off in small boats. Women and children cannot last much longer. Losing power.
Looking back at the ship crossing the North Atlantic that night, one belief shaped almost every decision before the collision. People truly believed the vessel could not fail in a catastrophic way. That belief did not stay in advertising or conversation. It shaped preparation, priorities, and judgment long before danger appeared. Because the ship was trusted to hold up under almost any condition, precautions were treated as normal procedures, not as something that might actually be needed. Lifeboat numbers were too few. Training lacked urgency. Emergency readiness was organized around control and order, not the possibility of sudden disaster. Safety systems were in place, yet they were built on confidence in survival rather than the expectation of failure. On the bridge, the same confidence shaped navigation. Ice warnings were received, but they were interpreted through the assumption that the ship could manage them. Speed remained high because vulnerability did not feel immediate. Human sight was considered enough because a serious threat was not expected. Each decision felt reasonable within the belief that the ship could not easily be overwhelmed by conditions. The ship's design showed the same confidence. Watertight compartments and strong materials were expected to hold back flooding long enough to recover. Planning focused on keeping the ship afloat, but paid less attention to how fast flooding could spread if several safeguards failed together.
Under the Atlantic, the open portholes meant that water flooded in at a much greater rate.
Regulations also supported this outlook. As long as the ship met existing rules, it was considered safe, even though ships had outgrown the conditions those rules were written for. Oversight didn't question that confidence, it supported it, and over time, the belief in safety kept reinforcing itself. What appears in the end is not a series of random mistakes, but a consistent environment shaped by expectation. When danger feels unlikely, preparation narrows. When the collision occurred, the response reflected the same confidence that shaped the ship's preparation. It was handled as a serious setback, but not as a disaster beyond control. The collision did not create vulnerability. It exposed what had been assumed all along.